Hello, hello, hello. Today we are going to be learning about two main things. First, we're going to be learning about local storage, and second, we're going to be learning about something called event delegation. So what we've got here is sort of a tapas menu where you can add things, and then if you want them, you can check and uncheck them. The cool thing where if you were to type in like taco, we'll say pork taco, hit enter, and then when I refresh the page, it's still there. And if I click on one of them to taco it or check it as normal people would do, you refresh, it's still going to be there. So that's going to be persisting our state with local storage. Next up, we're also going to be doing something called event delegation, because when I add another item here, like fish, and I click on it, I can taco it right away. Why can I do that? Because if you add an event listener on something that doesn't exist, you'll know that in the future, it won't be clicked. So we're going to look at that error as well and use event delegation to fix it. So I've gone ahead and just selected the add items, which in our case is this form element right here. So when someone submits that form, we're going to add an item. And then I've also selected this UL with a class of plates here. That's where we're going to load all of our tapas dishes into. And then finally, we're going to be storing all of our data in an array. It's going to be an array of objects, which has the name of the array as well as the status, whether it's tacoed or done or whatever it is that we are here. So we're going to go ahead and grab that form element, which is add items, and we're going to listen for the submit event. Why do we listen for the submit event here? Because that's what we actually need. A lot of times people, they listen for a click on this button, but you want to listen for a submit when someone hits enter, when someone clicks a button, when some external thing submits it. We need to make sure that we're covering all our bases. And by listening to the submit event, it's much more. And by listening to the submit event, we cover all of our bases with that. So we're going to run a function called add item when somebody submits it. And we're going to create that function here. It's going to give us the event. And let's just console log hello. I'm going to open mine up here, and I'm going to go to the console here. Now, when I type in something like fish, you see that, oh, hello was quickly flashed there. Let me do it again. Oh, if you click on this button here, preserve log, you can see what's happening here. I'm going to hit enter, and then automatically we log hello, and then we see navigated to, and this is the URLs of where I'm working here. So what's happening is our page is actually refreshing, and we don't want that. So what we can do is we can say e.prevent default, and that's going to stop the page from reloading, because by default, a form is just going to reload the page or send the data to an external source, generally what's your server side. In this case, we're going to be doing it all client side, so we prevent the default of that happening. Now, when I type in something and submit that, we don't get anything. Why is that? Because nothing is happening. If I were to console log hello once more, say hello, we see hello in the thing, but the page does not reload. Okay, now that we have that, what we need to do is to take that text of this box and put it into an object. So first of all, we are going to make an item, and that item is going to have two. It's going to have text of item name. We'll replace that in a second. It's going to have a done state of false. So by default, it's not going to be checked or tacoed. Now, how do we get this text here? Well, we can do this. Const text equals, and we're going to first grab this input box, which has a name of item on it. So we could say document.querySelector, but we can also do this .querySelector. And why can we do that? Name equals item. Why can we do that? That's because this is going to be the actual form. That's the whole form tag. And then we'll look inside of that form tag for something that has a name attribute of item. And that's really helpful if you have multiple forms on a page. You don't just want to be globally selecting it. You want to narrow down your search inside of the one form that we're working with. So we've got that text. And if we were just to wrap that whole thing in parentheses, it's going to execute first. And we can call .value against it, because that's going to give us the input. And then input has a property called value, which is whatever the user has typed into it. So now we can go here and type text Or if you've watched my ES6 videos, you know, instead of saying text colon text, we can use the ES6 shorthand property, which is just text. So we just created this object here. Let's console log the item. And let's go over to our console. Let's type in something like fish. And now when I run that, you should now see an object in your console that has a done, a false, and a text of whatever the user has put in there. And if you run it a couple times, you're going to get it console logged. One thing we want to do is clear that input. And what we can do is we can say this.reset, because this is the form element, and form elements have a method called reset on it. You've probably run into this where you've spent an hour filling out a form online somewhere and you accidentally click the reset button instead of the submit button. That's what it's hooked up to, is the dot reset. So let's see where we're at now. Fish. There we go. It refreshes it. It clears that. And we create this object. We're not seeing it because we're not console logging it. Now what we want to do is take that item here and put that into this items array. So what we do is we just say items.push item. Now let's take a fish and we will say squid. Now if we look at our items array, you see that we have object with two things in it. We could go one step further in console.table the items array, and you see that we have fish and squid. Now that's all we've done to get our data in it. It's not going to persist when we refresh just yet. We'll do that in just a second. But at this point, we need to create a second function that we're going to call populate list. And that's going to create the actual HTML here. So we're going to say function populate list. That populate list function needs two things. First of all, it needs a list of plates to populate. And we've stored that where? We stored that in our items array. So let me show you once more. If I type fish and look at our items array, you see that we have an array of things, which has a text of fish and done. So we need to pass in what that's going to be called. And you can call that items if you prefer to name the variable the same thing, but let's call that plates. And we're going to set that to be a default of an empty object. And the reason why I do that is because if for some reason you forget to pass in something, it's not going to break your JavaScript. It's just going to loop over an array of nothing, and then your map function will work just fine. And then second of all, we need a place to put the HTML, and that's called the plates list. And we are going to pass in our items list. So why am I doing that? Why am I not just like reaching outside and grabbing the list of items and grabbing the place where we'll dump them? And that's because I want this populate list function to be a little bit more resilient, meaning that I could pass in any array of plates and any destination HTML element, and it will work. So if in the future I decide to have two different lists or two different menus, that would be fine. I could still use a single populate list function and just pass it a different array of items and a different HTML element to dump it. So we go inside of here and we take this plates array here, and we are going to map over it. So we have map, we take our item, or let's call it plate, singular, and then we have the index, and I'll show you why we need that in just a second. Now, from here, this is going to return some HTML, so we're going to use backticks, and the last thing we need to do is in front of this plates.map is we need to stick this either in a variable or directly into the HTML. So I'm going to say plates list inner HTML equals, and I'll show you what this does in just a second. So we're going to loop over every single item in our array, and that's just an object, and we're going to map, which again, a map will take in an array of like raw data and return an array of some other data. And in our case, we're going to take in the objects and return a string from each one. That's why we're using these backticks here. So we're going to give ourselves a list item. And then let's just take a label, and let's forget about all the stuff. Let's just get it working. We'll put plate.text inside of it. So, and then last thing we need to do is call a .join on here, because map is going to return an array when really, if we're setting inner HTML, we just need one big string. So this little .join on the end is going to take this array that map makes and turn it into one big string. So if we have 6 or 7 items, it's not going to give us an array with 6 strings. It's going to give us one huge string. So now if we take this populate list, we go back up here right before we run it, and we run populate list, we're going to pass it our list of items and our items list. Let's try it out. So if I type fish, fish and squid and tacos. And you see what's happening here is that every time we add an item, we are calling this populate list function, which is then going to create a list item with a label inside of it. And you can inspect this and see what we've got going on here. It's going to create a list item. One thing that I should say is this populate list function, every time we add an item, it's recreating the entire list. So if you are really worried about performance, in this case, it's not a big deal. It's very, very fast. But if you were doing this maybe every half a second or every second, or you had a bunch of animations, you would want to look at how do I update just that one list item that I have rather than re-render the entire list. And that's where something like React or Angular becomes really helpful because they're smart enough to know, okay, rather than just blowing away this entire unordered list and re-rendering the whole thing, let me just figure out what's the minimum HTML that I need to change on the page without having to change the rest of it. So we've got this label here, and above it, I'm going to have an input with the type of checkbox. We need a data-index, and I'll show you why that's helpful in just a few minutes. And we're going to set that to the index that we have here. We're going to have an ID, which is going to be item I, because that's going to be item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4. And here we need to go back to our label and hook that ID up. So we'll say item I, and that's how when you click on the label, the input will check itself. That's how we link the two. The ID and the 4 are exactly the same thing. And then finally, we need to know whether or not these items are going to be checked or not. Because when I re-render it, if it's already checked, if it has a done status, we need to put the checked attribute. So if I were to say checked, then all of them would automatically be checked. So if I add fish, see that has a checked state, but we have to look at the items. We have to look at the items in there, and the first one has a property of done. So if it has a property of done, put the checked attribute. Otherwise, we leave it off because you might know that you cannot say checked equals false. That will still make it. Watch. If I say checked equals false and I type in fish, it still checks it. If I say checked equals emoji poop, it's still checked. And that's because any existence of the property checked or the attribute checked will make it checked. So we need to create a ternary operator here where we say if the plate.done attribute is true, then we're going to put the checked. Otherwise, we're going to do nothing, which is just an empty string. Sometimes I thought to put null here, but the word null will actually show up in your HTML. So you need 2 blank strings. Let's see if anything's broken. Good. Fish is working. And then when I click it, it will check the taco on and off. If you're wondering how I did this custom thing here, if you take a look at the input box, you'll see that I've displayed none it. If I take that off, the input box is actually still there. I've just hidden it with CSS. And if we open up our CSS here, let's look for the tacos. Here we go. What we say is the plate input, the label before it has a blank sort of emoji that's just a square. But then when the input is checked, turn that content from a blank square into a taco. So you could really put anything you wanted here and it will turn it on and off. It's sort of a little trick that you can do to make it work. I think it looks a little bit better. And that's a way that you can still have your proper checkbox for data, but you can display them with whatever HTML, CSS that you want. So we've got that up and running. And every time I add a new item, it will add it to the list and I can check it and uncheck it. The other problem here is that when I refresh the page, that list is not persisting. So what we're going to do is we're going to be storing our data in local storage. Now, if you've never worked with local storage before, essentially how it works is that you have this object in your window called local storage, or object in the browser, sorry, called local storage. And if you open that up, this is just a list of things that have been saved to this domain. So this is only computer by computer, browser by browser, website by website basis, but you're able to save text to the browser, and then when you reload the page, you'll be able to grab this text out of it. So if you go to your application tab in Chrome DevTools, there's a whole bunch of stuff here. If you go to local storage and click on the domain that you're working on, in this case, I'm working locally, so it's just a file, you should see that there's a key of items and a value of something else. Now, you might see a whole bunch of other stuff here, depending if you've ever run other applications on your local host. And this is where I've stored the text of what we're going for and the property of done to false or true, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we actually save that to local storage when we're done? Well, it's actually pretty easy. When we populate the list here, what we also need to do is set this items array into local storage. So you think you might be able to do this. Local storage dot, and then the API is dot set item, dot get item, and dot remove item or delete item. We'll double check that. So local storage dot set item, and we're going to set the items. That's the key right here, what it's going to be called. And then what are you going to set the data to? Well, you might just think, okay, I'll just pass items because that's my items array. Fish. Okay, so we just ran it. We added the item, we populated the list, and then we called local storage set items. We go to our local storage here, and you see this. Object. What does that mean? Well, what's happening here is that local storage, although it seems like it's an object, it's simply just a key value store, and you may only use strings in local storage. So if we were to take our items here and call .toString on it, you see object. And what's happening is that when you try to put something other than a string into local storage, the browser goes, I don't know how to handle this. Let me just convert it to a string, and let me just use the .toString method that exists on the number or the object or the array. In our case, it's an array. And what returns is the browser goes, object. And that's its representation. So we can't really do that because there's not actually an object here. It's just the word object. So what we actually need to do is stringify it before we convert it. So in the browser, we have this thing called json.stringify. And when you pass it your items, it's going to convert your objects and arrays into a JSON string equivalent. So we just need to wrap this sucker, json.parse items. And now when you add an item in here, fish, unexpected token at JSON. What is our problem? Oh, not parse, json.stringify. Parse is going to be the other way. Fish and tacos and yum. And now when you go to your application tab here, you see that this is now being stored. It looks like an array of objects, but it really is just text. And I can show you that because we can say local storage get items, and that is just a string. However, what you can do is you can wrap that thing in a json.parse, and that's going to then take it from the string and put it back into whatever it was initially. In this case, it's going to be an array of actual objects. So that's what we need to do on page load. We go down here, and when the page loads, the very last thing we'll say populate list, and we can say items. But again, you don't know. Like, do we have to do json.parse? No, not here. We are going to say items and items list, but the items doesn't exist on page load. Remember, at the first thing we do up here is we create an empty object. So what we can do is we can say items equals json.parse local storage.get items or a blank array. And what that will do is it's going to try get it from local storage, and then if it isn't there, it's going to fall back to an empty array. And then on page load, before we do any of this stuff, our items is going to be populated. And then when we reach here, we can call our populate list just as we did right here. So if we refresh the page now, whoa, you see that our fish, tacos, and yum is now persisting. I can refresh all that I want, and the data is always going to be there. So real quick review of what we just did there. When we add an item, you put it into local storage, and you update your local storage every single time. And then on page load, what's going to happen is that we check if there is something in local storage, and then we fall back to an empty array. Now, I just want to make sure that that still works with nothing. So we can go to our application, file, click on this thing, and exit. And then when we refresh the page, you see that there is nothing there. So if I type in items, you see that it's fallen back to this square bracket, which is a blank array. Okay, good. We are in good shape. Next, what we need to do is persist the toggling of it. Because if you add in fish and tacos and yum, and you check one and refresh the page, that state is no longer handled. So what we need to do is create a new function called toggle done. And then we're going to pass the event there. Now, when will this function run? Let's go down here. You think that you would select each of the checkboxes right here, and then listen for either a change or a click event on those checkboxes. And then when that happens, you will go ahead and perform something. Now, let me show you a real quick example. If I said const checkboxes equals document.querySelector all, and I'm just gonna select every input on the page, and I'll say checkboxes dot for each input dot add event listener, click, and then when that runs, I'm just going to run a quick function here that will alert hi. Okay, what I did there, when I click on a checkbox, we should alert hi. So click it, and when I click one of them, it should alert hi, but it's not working. What's going on here? Well, if we look at our checkboxes array, there's two things in there. And it's this thing. Okay, so if I click on that, that works. If I click on add item, that works. So where are these three inputs? Why are they not showing up in my node list? And the problem that we've run into here is that when this code runs, when our event listener runs, when our selector runs, this doesn't exist yet. Why? Because we need to populate the list first. So you might think, okay, that's fine. Let's populate the list first. And let's take a look at our checkboxes array. Okay, look at, there's more. There they are. Okay, are we out? Now if I click on one of these, okay, now it's working. But what happens if I add an additional item like beer? Hello. It adds it. Okay, good. Now I'm going to click on this checkbox. It doesn't work. Does yum still work? No. None of these work now. What's happening is because these inputs here are created after we listen for them, they don't have event listeners attached to them. The whole idea behind event delegation is rather than listening for a click or a change on these checkboxes directly, what we do is we look for somebody who is going to be on the page at the time of listening. And if we look at our HTML here, you're going to see that that unordered list that holds everything, UL with a class of plates, that does exist. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen for a click on the plates, and then we're going to figure out, did they actually mean to click one of the inputs inside of it? So I always like to think of event delegation as very responsible parents, like UL with a class of plates, and very negligent children who don't necessarily hear any instructions from the parent. So what we're saying is, hey, plates, when your children inputs get clicked, can you please pass this click on to them? Rather than you handling the click directly, we're just telling you, because you're the only one responsible here, so that when someone clicks it, if it's for one of your children, I don't know if they're your current children or you're going to make more children in the future, but if you make more in the future, make sure you tell them to handle this click. So you got to think of like responsible parent, negligent child who doesn't necessarily know what to do with the click, so the parent has to tell it what to do. So let's go back to this code here. We're going to delete these checkboxes here if you type that. We just want this populate list and add item event listener. And we are going to listen for the click on the unordered list, which is this items list right here. So we'll say items list, and just duplicate this. Items list at add event listener. We're going to listen for a click. And when that happens, we're going to toggle done. And then inside of here, I'm going to console log the E. Let's go back to our console here. Now let's click on one of these. Oh, okay. That's interesting. We're getting two different mouse event handlers. Let's click on this one right here. Whoa, what's going on here? So we're getting two different event listeners here when we click on something. And what we can do a little bit further is if we look at the target of that event, let's see what we're working with here. Click on tacos. So what's happening here is that we're clicking on the item and we're also clicking on the checkbox, because this is in turn, our click on label is in turn checking the checkbox, which will trigger a click on the actual input. Okay, good. And then what else? Like if we click on something here that isn't necessarily the list item or the input, you see the labels there. If we click like right here in between, what do we get? We get the LI. So you see, as we click different items, the target is going to be a little bit different. What we want to do here is we want to check if the target matches the thing that we're looking for. So we'll say if the e.target.matches, this is a new API in the browser, input, and this is sort of like if you've ever worked with jQuery, .is an input, it's the same thing as .matches. Then we want to return, which means like skip this unless it's an input. And then let's console log the target. There we go. Now, wherever we click, we're only getting input checks. Good. So now we have that working. That's event delegation, where we listen for a click on something higher, and then inside of it, we check if it's the actual thing that we want, because it could trigger on a few different things. Now what we want to do is we want to go to our items array, and we want to find the one that was checked and set the done to be true or false, depending on what state it's in. So we can first get the index, and this is why I gave each input a data-index value, because we can then use that to reference where it is in the array. So if we say const L equals e.target, just put it in its own. Now that we have that element, we can console.log l.dataset.index, and this is why we put a data-index on each of the checkboxes. And you check one, it's going to tell you the index of the corresponding item in the array. And then from that, we'll take that index, we'll stick it in its own variable, just for simplicity's sake. And then we'll take our items with the index, and we'll access the done property, and we'll set it to itself, but this is the trick, the opposite. So if this is true, it's going to be the opposite, which is false. If this is false, it's going to be the opposite, which is true. So this is just flip-flopping between true and false. And then we're going to do the same thing that we did with the stringify local storage right here. Take that and stick it right in here. And then we will run populate list once more, which will update the actual visibility part on here. So we're going to change the property. We're going to store that in local storage, and we're going to visually update what's on our page. So now when we refresh tacos, and I should refresh the page now, tacos is always going to be true. Why? Because if we go to our application and we look at our local storage here, you should see that tacos is true and done is false. And if I were to just mainly change this to false and the first one to true, and I refresh the page, you'll see now fish is checked and tacos. So we're just, every time we make a change, we are going to mirror that to local storage and then re-render the entire list. Or even better, if you can figure out how do I just re-render that, just that one, that's even better. So that's it for today's. What I will now challenge you to do is make a button right here that says clear all or check all or uncheck all. And when you click that delete button, it'll delete all of them. When you click check all, it will make them all checked. And when you click uncheck all, it will uncheck all of them and mirror it to local storage as well as rerun this populate list. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.